Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our AI in Action series, where leading minds in AI from across the world share their story, success, and advice. AI in Action cuts through the hype and explores the true impact of artificial intelligence in our world today.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Andrew Konya. Andrew is the CEO at Remesh. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
That's our pleasure. So, Andrew, let's start with a background of yourself, please. Can you give us a bit of an overview of your background in technology and what led to you launching and founding Remesh?
Yeah, certainly. I initially started my life as a physicist. I studied problems that involved emergent phenomenon in complex systems, like liquid crystals. My specialty in doing it was applying supercomputing to those class of problems, and I thought that was the trajectory that I was going to go on with my life, was theoretical physics and supercomputing. Along the way, I made some friends who ended up on either side of a conflict in the Middle East, and as a physicist, I was well primed for existential crisis and became obsessed with how conflicts happen, how they're sustained, and why they're hard to bring to conclusion. And embedded in there was this really easy to define, extremely hard to solve problem of being able to represent a population of people. And so through that obsession, decided that I wanted to take this technical toolbox that I had developed, applying a class of algorithms that now I guess we probably call machine learning, to physics problems, and start applying it to making it easier to understand people. And that was how Remesh was born.
Andrew, thank you for sharing. You've already given us a hint into the origins behind Remesh. So tell us all about Remesh. What is the mission of the business? What are you guys doing? And then we can talk about the journey from when you first launched it, coming up on 9 years ago now.
Indeed, yeah. Philosophically, we think of ourselves as existing to align the direction that humanity goes in with the direction that humanity wants to go in. And all across the world, in any given day, in any given moment, there's a whole bunch of decisions that are being made that impact the populations that are around them. And our goal, or our mission, is to be able to take those populations who are being impacted, represent them to the people who are making the decisions that impact them. We think of this as a simple goal of enable anyone to understand a population, and we think about how to apply technology to do this.
Thank you, Andrew. So as I mentioned, look, 9 years, I'm sure it's been quite the journey. Can you give us some insight into what it's been like from when you first launched as a business and how you guys have grown, but then also the evolution of this technology? Because 9 years in machine learning is a long time, and I'm sure you guys have got some interesting stories to tell about how you've kept up with it, with this ever-changing technology. So to help us understand what it's been like.
So when we got started, the thesis was simple. What we wanted to do was to take the dynamic of live one-on-one conversation, like we're having here, but maybe in chat, and scale that infinitely. So be able to scale that to an entire population of people. When we started, we used simple algorithms, we used simple kind of inference models, would give us a sense of what would represent a population. We'd basically ask the entire population, have people say in natural language what they think, and then have a few other have those people vote on what each other said in that population. What has evolved over time significantly is the efficiency of the models that we use to convert a very sparse amount of votes to a really accurate prediction of what represents a population. I think our first algorithms, our first bits of technology were like simple Python code, coded up during a hackathon. What has evolved a lot, and actually just recently in the last few years, is the increasing use of language models. So now we not only solve it as a kind of generic inference or prediction problem, but on one that is very specifically conditioned on the language of those responses that people are voting on. And so as transformer models and language models have gotten better, we've been able to exploit those to make our models more accurate and predictive as well. And what's cool about that is that the result is that in order for us to accurately represent a population, the amount of data that we have to gather on that population keeps getting smaller and smaller. So the burden to represent them that we have to ask from them is less. I think the other cool vector of progress for myself personally, as we've evolved the company, has been what tech has been applied to. Admittedly, we didn't come out of the gate and actually provide anything useful to the UN for negotiating peace or something like this. We initially were used just by big market research agencies and big consultancies and brands trying to understand their customers and CEOs trying to understand their employees. But in the past few years, we've actually now started to be used actively by the UN in negotiating ceasefires and in the mission of peacekeeping and peacemaking, which has been quite cool. There's a lesson maybe embedded in there on how mature technology has to be before you can really use it for life or death things. And that sometimes it takes years to get there, but we're there now and it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, indeed. And I know you gave some early examples as to who was using the platform, and I'm sure it's evolved over time. Could you give us a recent example of a customer who you guys got connected with who had a particular problem that they were trying to solve? And what's the journey like from first conversation to implementing your technology and the impact for that customer?
Yeah, I'll leave them nameless. Let's call this a big technology company. So their problem was that their leadership was having a hard time understanding what was going on throughout the stack of their company, right? So they knew what the people who directly reported to them were doing and what they were feeling and what the culture was like there. But the further they got away from it, the more they felt disconnected. And this was amplified by the at least partial or total remote world that they've been living in for the past few years. So we got connected to them. They walked us through the problem and we walked them through how we've seen others, ourselves included, use Remesh to solve it, which is to take that group of leaders, really, we take the CEO, plug them into one side of our application, allow the employees to plug into the other side of the application, and we facilitate a live conversation between a CEO and that group of employees. So obviously all the tech that we built fades in the background during this experience. CEO asks something or says something, the employees all then collectively respond. So they all respond in their own natural language. They start casting votes on each other's responses, and then we use that, train up our model, find the responses that are most representative of that entire employee base, show that to the CEO, and that whole cycle takes about a minute and a half, and the CEO responds, and they go back and forth and back and forth. So we got them set up to do that. Maybe it took a week or two to logistically have them wrap their minds around it and start scheduling like the time, what they would call a town hall, that they have this conversation with their employees. And then alas, 2 weeks later, set him up, he ran it, and learned a whole bunch of things that were counterintuitive, or I'll say against the narrative of what their management was thinking in terms of what was causing disruptions for their employee base. And I can say went on from there to then hold, I think bi-weekly probably, conversations with his employees, and went from a world where, I think in his words, felt like he was driving blind a little bit in guiding the organization through this quite large company. And now would say he feels quite connected to employees, has a good sense of what's going on, and actually now thinks of them as a collective intelligence that is always a few keystrokes away that he can tap to figure out anything that's going on. Maybe a very specific or it's one-off example. But
yeah, it's a great one. It's great because it really helps us listening and the audience view the immediate impact. And for a lot of our audience who are tech people working for a company that would want to influence change, this would be a great way to do it. Glad you shared it.
You are listening to the Alldus podcast. When you're looking to scale your team, or if you are interested in showcasing your company in a future episode, reach out today. Or if you're in the market for a new role, visit our website to view open positions, www.alldus.com.
I want to now spend a bit of time understanding the current team setup, the dynamic, and what it's like behind the scenes, particularly in your use of AI. So whether it's ML models, the data engineering for data ingestion, the analytics behind it all. Can you give us a look behind the scenes and how it all gets to a point of customer impact?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll maybe work backwards through the stack as it impacts the customer. So obviously the kind of last bit of that assembly line is that the customer sees the product. Internally, we operate with independent, autonomous customer or product teams. So I think we've got a handful, maybe 2 handfuls of these, and each one of them is focused on a general component of our product intersected with a need of a user. Some of those are more focused on the infrastructure that our product is going to sit in. So some of these are quite literally infrastructure team. They're thinking more about all things back end, and their customers, almost the developers themselves. Then we have teams that are focused on product features that aren't necessarily, they don't need to be ML powered or AI or anything like this. They're what glues the product together, gives it cohesivity, manages teams and accounts and enterprise security and all of these things. And then we have teams that build around some of the core features or the core experiences that do have to leverage our core algorithms or bring in new ones. So for those teams, generally they will have a few engineers embedded in those teams who have a combination of ML experience, backend engineering experience, and I think you'd call it data engineering experience. So this trifecta. And what they do is they work closely with our research team. And our research team are the tip of the spear on this. So their job is to take a problem we need to solve, understand the literature and everything that is out there today, make a determination whether we can take something that's already been developed and tweak it, optimize it, tune it for our application, or they develop totally new algorithms or learning applications from scratch. Then once we prove out either the third-party solution or develop and prove out the viability of the one that we're going to deploy our own, then that's where the handshake happens between our research, our R&D team, and those engineers embedded on the teams that are going to put that into the product. There's quite a lot of work that will happen there. It's very different to go from, say, a Jupyter notebook that proves something to some running in a production environment that can be used by the UN in a war zone. But that's where the next bit of magic happens. And I would say that is one part infrastructure engineering, because everything has to be containerized and have the right redundancies, but then it has to be tested. And so I've learned that developing test cases around things like ML algorithms is a different beast than just doing standard unit testing. So that handshake happens there. For the perspective of people who fancy themselves data folks or ML people or researchers, I think that's where they would see the magic is happening, is this handshake that happens between our R&D team and the academic world that's creating knowledge, and then our product teams who have data engineers on them who are turning the new capabilities in the world into products that our customers are touching.
Staying on the topic of theme, you were speaking last week and you were talking about the exciting growth ahead, particularly looking at the second half of this year. You've obviously scaled the business consistently over the last 9 years, but we're approaching a new and exciting chapter for Remesh. Can you give us some insight into where you see the business going in the next year ahead? And with that, what sort of opportunities are there going to be for people who are interested in this kind of work, who have a data or engineering background?
So I'll say is that thus far, our product has largely been used by people who are really experts at doing some kind of research. A lot of different flavors of research for employees or citizens or consumers, but they've all been super expert. Where we are starting to go now is to try and build some of that expertise into our platform. And that means building, in certain cases, automating things sometimes doesn't actually have to do anything with AI, but in our case, some of it actually does. You have to learn some patterns and imbue them in the platform. The other notable extension happening over the next year or so is that we aim to further leverage what we would think of as our core technology, that core technology being something that lets us ingest end data points and output confidence as if we had way more than end data points. And that magic right now is what makes our live many-to-one conversation possible at all. And that's what we focused it on. But as we go forward, we're going to start opening up that technology and thinking about how to apply it in new ways where solving the problem of not enough data matters a lot. For those who are interested, there's probably obviously two obvious ways I can think. One is, as we think about our team growing, I imagine that intersection, our need for folks doing that is going to go up. The second is that we collaborate a reasonable amount with academics and folks who are just interested in this problem of, philosophically, what does it mean to actually represent a population? There's a whole bunch embedded in that. What are the ethics involved in this? When you're doing this in life and death situations, how do you get the ethics? 3, how do you solve the really hard underlying technical problems? Some of them have information theoretic limits that are interesting to understand and exploit. Other parts of it are how to build really large scale online learning. And other parts of it are thinking about how to solve low rank matrix completion problems. And so I think we to work with the best people in the world on the specific subclass of problems that we run into. And so we'd love to work with kind of folks in any walk of life that are the best in the world with those things.
Absolutely. Andrew, I want to now get your take on the next chapter for Remesh. 9 years is a long time in the technology world, and you guys have been growing and increasing not just your customer base, but the team internally due to the demand for this technology. When you look ahead for the next few years with the continued growth, what are you most excited about for the future of the business?
That's a good question. I think there's two things, and I'll contextualize both as noting that I think a business like ours is nonlinear, which means the more we output, the more that gets generated that we input, that means the more we output. So there's a flywheel effect. So to be frank, part of what I'm excited about over a 10-year horizon is that flywheel effect compounded for 10 more years, I imagine to be awesome. But more specifically, I think there's two things that I'll break down into just straight impact and technological progress. We think of impact in our world as generally being proportional to the number of decisions in the world that are being made that are impacting a population that we can inject the truth about that population into. Where we've been growing for 7 years and have gone through a couple orders of magnitude of growth compared to the $72 trillion of spend that happens every year, it's still a tiny fraction that we are actually impacting. And I think that over the next decade or so, we should be able to scale up our impact significantly. If by that point, most governments and most large organizations aren't using Remesh to be held accountable to the populations they impact, then I will be quite disappointed. The second dimension I think that is really exciting is progress of technology. In having to solve the problem we do, which is to be able to predict data we don't have to represent people, it's forced us down what has felt for a while like a bit of a niche path that I think is starting to come online in a real way. We refer to it as representative intelligence. And the initial idea of it is pretty simple. Can we train an AI to stand in for a person and speak on their behalf in a way that accurately represents them? And this started as a way of just solving a missing data problem. But as we've started extrapolating forward and looking forward at what might be on the horizon, there starts to be a lot of interesting things that you can do with this. Any problem that involves understanding what a person thinks or wants or would say, all of a sudden become tractable. If that AI potentially is owned by the person who it corresponds to, you can start seeing a world of some very different business models. But I don't want to open that up quite yet, and I'll save some crypto conversations for another day.
Definitely. Maybe we can come back and do another interview in a couple of years when you guys venture into that world. But I know you've got your hands full with the ever-growing demand for your existing industry. I'm sure you'll be busy. But Andrew, listen, thank you so much for coming on today and speaking with us. Very much appreciate it. It was great to learn about the journey and evolution of Remesh and how you're using ML models and the impact. I think that's the coolest part of what you're doing and applicable to all businesses of all sizes. Wish you, the team in Remesh and everyone involved the best of luck in the years ahead and continued success.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.